The galaxy had long enjoyed a period of peace that spanned centuries. No wars, no conflicts, just the hum of the stars and the steady progress of civilization. It was a golden age for every race and faction in the known universe. But like all good things, peace came to an end when a strange dark force emerged from the farthest reaches of space. They called themselves the worst species. No one knew their true name. Their origins were lost to time, but their presence was undeniable. The first sign came not in a sudden explosion or grand invasion, but in the eerie stillness of their arrival. Their ships didn't roar through space or engage in any dramatic maneuvering. Instead, they simply appeared without warning, like shadows that crept into the fabric of the universe. Their black ships seemed to swallow the light around them. Their technology was unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Their energy signatures almost impossible to detect. Their weapons precise and deadly. Their tactics ruthless and without mercy. The galactic military had faced many threats before, but nothing like this. Their scouts ventured too close and vanished without a trace. No distress signals, no wreckage, just emptiness in their wake. No one could understand how they operated or why they left no sign of their intentions. It was as if they were ghosts haunting the stars, leaving only the fading echoes of their terror behind. Their ships moved like predators circling their prey, just waiting for the right moment to strike, and when they did, it was quick and brutal. They wiped entire colonies off the map without a second thought. Entire populations reduced to ash in an instant. But they weren't just killing, they were erasing history. These were not simple raids. This was annihilation on a galactic scale. They targeted the weak and the strong alike, the defenseless and the powerful. They didn't care for resources or territory. They destroyed everything in their path, as if they wanted to scrub the universe clean of any trace of life. And what made it worse was how efficient they were. No war was ever fought against them for too long. No resistance lasted more than a few days. There were no great battles, no heroic last stands, just the cold inevitability of their onslaught. Some said they were a race bent on galactic domination. Others said they were an ancient species that had come to reclaim their birthright. Still others whispered darker theories about their true nature. No one had any answers, only fear. As the first few colonies fell, the rest of the galaxy went into panic. Stations, entire systems sent distress calls to the Galactic Council. But there was no help, no answers, only the grim certainty that the worst species was coming for them too. The galaxy's greatest minds and generals scrambled to find a solution. They studied the wreckage left behind by the enemy. They tried to reverse engineer their technology. They searched for patterns in the attacks, but nothing worked. Every attempt to understand or confront them ended in failure, and with every passing day the terror grew. The worst species was unstoppable, and they were not done yet. The galaxy had no way of knowing what was coming next, but one thing was certain: it was coming for them all. The first true encounter with the worst species came without warning. The peaceful colony of Binge 4 had been nestled on the outer rim, a tranquil world home to farmers and researchers who had never known conflict. Its people had lived their lives in harmony with nature and the stars. They were untouched by the struggles of the core worlds, where battles were fought over resources or political power. Binge 4 had been a sanctuary, a place of quiet progress and unity. But when the first ships arrived on the horizon, no one knew what they were seeing at first. Some thought it was a new wave of explorers, or perhaps a diplomatic mission from another system. But that thought was quickly shattered as the ships came closer. The silence of their approach was unnerving. No engines roaring, no radio transmissions, no sign of any communication. They just appeared like shadows in the sky. As their sleek black vessels hovered above the colony, a deep, unsettling dread fell over the people of Binge 4. They had no warning, no time to react. As the ships began to lower their weaponry, their energy weapons glowed faintly before unleashing hell upon the surface. With a violent burst that struck the heart of the city, the buildings crumbled under the first salvo. Entire blocks disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if they had never existed at all. The people screamed and ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The worst species didn't target the defenses or military installations. They didn't care about strategic positions. They targeted the people, the heart of the colony. They sought to destroy everything that made it whole. Nothing was spared. No military force, no innocent child, no elderly person caught in the chaos. All were erased from existence. In moments, the remaining survivors who had hidden in shelters felt the vibrations of the attack, but they couldn't understand what was happening. They had no words for it. The devastation was too complete, too final. The ships above released more pulses of destructive energy, each one taking the greater toll as the death toll soared. There was no mercy, no negotiation, just an overwhelming force that tore through the colony with relentless precision. And when it was over, there was nothing left of Benara 4 but ruins. The sky was filled with the ashes of the dead, the ground scorched and barren, as the ships of the worst species hovered above, watching it all. They did not leave immediately. Instead, they circled the remains as if savoring their victory. It was then that a strange thing happened. A small group of survivors had been hiding in a remote shelter beneath the surface of the planet. They were the lucky few who had managed to avoid the full brunt of the attack. When the ships finally departed, the survivors emerged from their hiding places. With fear in their eyes and disbelief in their hearts, they saw their homes gone, their families lost. Yet there was something strange in the air, something that made them question everything they had known. The worst species hadn't killed them all. It was as if they had been left alive on purpose. The survivors found no sense in it at first, but as they began to piece together their fragmented memories, they realized something horrifying. The worst species had feared them. They hadn't exterminated every living soul from Benara 4 as they had done with every other colony. No, they had left these survivors alive. And now they had to wonder, why had they been spared? What was the real reason they were allowed to live? Could it be that the worst species feared something greater than themselves? The survivors of Benara 4 were a broken group of men and women, mostly civilians, but they had seen the worst of what the galaxy could offer. They had witnessed the horrific annihilation of their world, and in the aftermath, they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. As they gathered in what remained of their shelters, they began to discuss their survival, their minds racing with questions that couldn't be answered. They had narrowly escaped death, yet something about their survival felt wrong. They had not been spared because they were strong or capable. No, they had been spared for another reason, something that none of them could fully comprehend. They began to share their stories, their experiences of the attack, and something began to emerge, a pattern. No one had died outright in the attack. The worst species had torn through the colony with brutal efficiency, but they hadn't killed everyone in the same way. Some had been left untouched. Entire sections of the city had been obliterated, yet certain people had been ignored entirely. No explanation for it, no logic behind it, no clear reasoning. And it was then that one of the survivors made a chilling observation. They weren't just sparing lives, they were targeting something deeper within their prey. It was as if the worst species had known something about them, something that had kept them alive. It was a feeling that none of them could shake, a fear that was deeper than simple survival. But there was more. The survivors quickly discovered that something else was at play, something bigger than their world, than their race, than the Galactic War. They now found themselves a part of it. Was a truth buried in the ancient records of the galaxy, one that had been lost to time, a myth that was whispered about by the oldest races. It was the legend of an ancient species that had once dominated the galaxy, a race older than the worst species, and one that was said to have vanished long before the rise of the current galactic powers. But according to these old stories, this species was the true rulers of the stars, and their power was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their technology was so advanced that the most powerful empires in the galaxy had been nothing more than fleeting moments in time. Compared to their reign, it was said that when the worst species came to power, they feared this ancient species more than anything else. And in their fear, they'd fled into the deep void of space, hiding themselves from the shadows of the galaxy. But now they were back. Or so the survivors believed. They had uncovered something in the remains of their destroyed world, something that hinted at the return of this forgotten species. But there were no answers, no clear evidence, just an overwhelming sense of dread as they realized the worst species had known what they had found and feared it. Whatever this ancient race was, the worst species feared it and had wiped out every trace of it across the galaxy. But why had they spared the survivors of Benara 4? Were they connected to this race somehow, or had the worst species simply missed something in their search for answers? The survivors had no time to ponder these questions for long. As the galaxy's alarms began to blare once again, the worst species was coming, and the survivors knew one thing for certain: whatever this ancient race was they were the key to fighting back. The survivors of Benara 4 had no time to dwell on the mystery they had uncovered. The worst species were already on their way again. And this time the survivors knew they couldn't hide forever. They had already been marked by the shadowy invaders. But what they didn't know was that their discovery would set something much larger in motion. As they sent out their message to the galaxy, they felt the weight of their situation. Their once peaceful world was now a symbol of destruction and the galaxy's greatest fear. But there was hope. Humanity had always been a wild card in the galaxy's order, a species of seemingly insignificant creatures, with no grand empire, no mighty fleet, no ancient history to their name. Yet the humans had a knack for surviving the impossible. They had faced extinction and come back stronger for it. The survivors of Benara 4 hoped that humanity might be their salvation. If they could make contact, they might be the only ones who could fight back against the overwhelming might of the worst species. So the survivors pooled together every scrap of technology they had managed to salvage from the wreckage of their world and sent a signal into the unknown, a desperate cry for help, hoping against hope that the humans would answer. The signal was weak, but it was enough to reach the outer edges of the galaxy, where humanity had established themselves in isolated colonies. They had long since been dismissed by the Galactic Council as unimportant, but the survivors had no other choice but to trust in their forgotten strength. When the signal was finally received, humanity's response was immediate and overwhelming. They did not question the situation. They did not hesitate or delay. They mobilized without question. Their fleet began to assemble almost as if they had been waiting for something to ignite their wrath. It wasn't long before humanity's finest ships arrived on the scene, small at first, but growing in number with each passing day. The survivors watched in awe as humanity's forces arrived, not with the pomp and circumstance of grand empires, but with the simplicity of purpose. They came not to conquer, but to defend, to survive, and to protect. Humanity's soldiers were unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Their ships were built for combat, but with an added resilience that made them stand out against the alien fleets of the worst species. They fought with a fierceness that was entirely human. Their tactics were unpredictable, driven by raw instinct and creativity. They had no fear of dying, because they had faced death many times before and conquered it each time. The survivors of Benara 4 felt a sense of awe as they watched humanity's forces build and prepare, but there was a lingering question in their minds. Did humanity truly know what they were up against? Could they stand against the worst species? And when was it possible for a race so young to defeat something as ancient and terrifying as the worst species? The survivors had no answers, but they knew this humanity was their last hope, and they would fight alongside them with every last breath they had. It was time to face the worst species head-on and discover the true cost of survival in a galaxy at war. As humanity's fleet gathered strength, the survivors of Benara 4 watched with a mixture of hope and fear. They had seen the worst species destroy entire colonies without a second thought, and now they were about to face them head-on with humanity's forces standing alongside them. They knew the stakes were higher than ever before. Yet, as the days passed, something began to shift. Humanity was not only fighting to defend their own, but to reclaim something that had been lost, a sense of purpose. They had been a forgotten species in the grand scale of the galaxy, but now they were the last hope. They were more than just soldiers or pilots. They were a fire that had been kindled in the darkest moments of their history, and now it was burning brighter than ever before. The first clash between humanity and the worst species came without warning. Their ships appeared like shadows against the backdrop of distant stars, silent and terrifying. The survivors on the ground felt the vibrations of the approaching fleet, and they braced themselves for the inevitable. But when the worst species attacked this time, something was different. Humanity did not flinch or flee. Instead, they moved with a precision that caught the worst species off guard. Their ships engaged with calculated purpose and fierce determination. Humanity's tactics were unpredictable. Where the galaxy's other forces relied on tradition and structure, humanity relied on instinct and the element of surprise. They used the environment to their advantage, weaving through asteroid fields and debris to avoid the worst species' powerful weapons, and striking from places where they least expected. The worst species had never encountered an enemy like this before. They had always relied on overwhelming force and fear to win, but humanity's resilience and creativity began to turn the tide. Small skirmishes broke out all across the galaxy as humanity's forces fought back with a relentlessness that startled the worst species. They were not the weak prey they had assumed they were. Humanity was not only surviving, they were making them bleed, and for the first time in this war, the worst species began to feel doubt. They did not understand how this species could rise so quickly from the ashes of destruction and strike back with such ferocity and ingenuity. The survivors of Binge 4 watched with disbelief as humanity's fleets won small victories one by one, pushing the worst species back from their territory inch by inch. But the worst species were not easily deterred. They regrouped quickly and came back with even more force. Their ships darkened the skies as they arrived in greater numbers. Humanity was facing their first true test. Their fleet was smaller and less experienced than the enemies, but their hearts burned with a strength that made up for their lack of numbers. In a brutal battle that stretched across multiple systems, humanity fought with everything they had, knowing that they could not afford to lose. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the future of the galaxy, and humanity was beginning to prove that they were a force to be reckoned with. The survivors of Binge 4 knew that their world was lost. But if humanity could win this battle, then their suffering would not be in vain. They had uncovered something far more important than they ever imagined. They had found their salvation in the most unlikely of places. A species that was once ignored and underestimated was now humanity's greatest weapon. And with every victory they achieved, the worst species' grip on the galaxy began to loosen. As humanity's forces began to gain ground, the survivors of Binge 4 felt a surge of hope. They had watched as humanity took on the worst species and struck back with ferocity, but there was a growing realization among them that this was not enough. The worst species had only been pushed back for now, and they would return in greater numbers. The survivors understood that this was not a battle that could be won with sheer force alone. The worst species had an overwhelming advantage in technology and power, and their sheer numbers could eventually overwhelm any defense, no matter how clever. So the survivors and humanity's generals began to dig deeper into the mysteries they had uncovered about the ancient species, the one that had once ruled the galaxy, the one that the worst species feared. It became clear that this forgotten race held the key to defeating the worst species, but no one knew where to find them or what kind of weaponry they possessed. The survivors had managed to gather fragments of ancient records and relics from the ruins of their homeworld, but it wasn't enough to decipher the full scope of their power. Humanity scientists began working around the clock to decode the information, and it was there that they found the first real breakthrough. Hidden in the ruins of an ancient temple on Binge 4 was a map that seemed to lead to an unknown part of the galaxy, far beyond any known systems, a place where the ancient race had once been based. It was a long shot, but it was all they had. Humanity's fleet prepared for the next phase of the battle. Their leaders agreed that finding the remnants of this ancient race might be their only hope to defeat the worst species. The survivors had no choice but to follow. They boarded ships alongside humanity's forces, setting off into the unknown in search of something that could turn the tide of the war. But what they didn't know was that the worst species was watching them. Every move they made was being tracked. Their ships had been detected as they left the ruins, and the worst species had already begun to mobilize their forces to stop them. The survivors and humanity traveled deep into uncharted space, following the ancient map and hoping they weren't walking into a trap. They were tired, exhausted from months of fighting, but they knew they had no choice. If they did not find this race or their weapons, then all would be lost. The journey was long and filled with uncertainty. The farther they went, the more they realized just how little they knew about the galaxy around them. They entered systems that had not been mapped in centuries. They encountered strange new worlds with ecosystems unlike anything they had seen before. And finally, after months of searching, they arrived at the edge of a forgotten star system. It was a place where no one had ventured in millennia. The planets were barren and lifeless, but at the center of the system was a massive structure, an ancient fortress that seemed to pulse with power. The survivors and humanity made their way toward it cautiously, but as they did, they began to realize the truth. They weren't the only ones who had found this place. The worst species had already arrived. Their forces were gathered in the shadows of the ancient fortress, preparing for a final confrontation. The survivors felt a chill run through their ranks. They had come this far only to realize that they were walking into the worst species trap. But there was no turning back now. They had no choice but to face whatever awaited them within the walls of the ancient fortress, and hope that it held the power to destroy their enemies once and for all. The survivors and humanity's forces approached the ancient fortress. With a mixture of dread and anticipation, the structure loomed large before them, an imposing edifice of dark stone and metallic surfaces that seemed to hum with an ancient energy. The closer they got, the more they could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. This place had been built by a race that was older than the galaxy itself, and now it was their only hope for survival. But as they neared the entrance, they felt the shift in the air. Something was wrong. The worst species had been waiting for them. They had set up a blockade around the fortress. Their ships were positioned at every angle, blocking any attempt at retreat or escape. They had anticipated the survivors' arrival, and now they were ready to make their final stand. Humanity's fleet moved into position, preparing for battle. But the survivors knew that this would be no ordinary fight. The worst species had only grown stronger with time. Their tactics had become more refined, and their weapons more devastating. They were ready to crush any resistance that dared to oppose them. But the survivors and humanity had something the worst species hadn't counted on. They had the spirit to fight back against overwhelming odds. They didn't care about tradition or strategy. They only cared about survival and revenge. The first shots were fired in a blaze of light as the worst species ships opened fire on humanity's fleet. But the humans did not flinch. They responded with all the power they had. The battle raged in space above the ancient fortress. But the survivors knew that the true fight was still within its walls. Their goal was not to destroy the worst species fleet. It was to reach the heart of the fortress and uncover the power hidden within. They pushed forward into the depths of the structure, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning every corner for threats. But there was something else in the air, something they couldn't quite explain. It was as if the fortress itself was alive. Its walls seemed to shift and pulse with an energy that was almost organic. And as they ventured deeper, they found something that no one had anticipated. The fortress was not just a relic of the past. It was a weapon that had been designed to destroy the worst species and everything in its path. It had been dormant for eons, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now that moment had come. The survivors felt a surge of hope. This was the key to ending the war. They had found the weapon they had been searching for. But as they activated the fortress's core, they realized the terrifying truth. This weapon was not just powerful, it was unpredictable. The energy it released was beyond anything they could control. It was a volatile force that could easily destroy them all if they weren't careful. And in the midst of their hesitation, the worst species launched a final assault on the fortress. Their ships were closing in fast, and the survivors and humanity had only moments to prepare for the confrontation of their lives. They had found their weapon, but now they had to survive long enough to use it. The stakes had never been higher. If they failed, then everything they had fought for would be lost. But if they succeeded, they could destroy the worst species once and for all. The survivors took their positions, ready to fight to the death. They had come too far to back down now. The battle reached a fever pitch as the worst species pressed in from all sides. Their ships were closing in fast, and the fortress hummed with a terrifying power. The survivors and humanity's forces had no time to waste. The weapon inside the ancient structure was their only hope, but it was unstable and dangerous. They had to make it work, or everything would be lost. The survivors scrambled to activate the core of the fortress. As the air around them crackled with energy, the hum grew louder, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if the fortress itself was waking up from a long slumber. Humanity's fleet fought valiantly above them, their ships moving like shadows through the darkness of space, dodging blasts and firing back with everything they had. But they were losing ground. The worst species were too strong, their numbers too overwhelming. It was a fight they could not win alone. And deep within the fortress, the survivors worked in a frenzy. The core was beginning to power up, but it wasn't enough. The energy was still unstable, and the worst species were moments away from overrunning the structure. They had to make a choice. They could either use the weapon and risk destroying everything, including themselves, or they could try to fight on without it, knowing they would be slaughtered in the process. But the survivors didn't hesitate. They knew what had to be done. The weapon had to be fired. They couldn't waste any more time. They activated the final sequence, and the core of the fortress flared to life. A burst of light and energy erupted from the structure, sending shockwaves through the battlefield. Above, the worst species ships were caught in the blast. Their shields collapsed under the force, and their vessels were torn apart in a blinding explosion. Humanity's fleet took advantage of the chaos and struck with all the fury they had left. They moved in like a swarm of hornets, attacking the weakened ships of the worst species and tearing them apart with brutal efficiency. But even as the worst species were being defeated, the survivors knew the true cost of their victory. The weapon had worked, but at a price. The fortress was collapsing. The energy it had unleashed was far too powerful to contain, and now the entire structure was coming apart around them. They had no time to celebrate their victory. They had to escape, and they had to do it quickly. As the walls of the fortress began to crumble, the survivors and humanity's forces fought their way to the exit, knowing that the worst species had been defeated. But at what cost? The Galactic War was over, but the damage had been done. The survivors of Binge 4 looked out into the stars as they escaped the crumbling fortress. They had lost everything, but they had won the war. The galaxy would never be the same again, but they had saved it from destruction. The worst species had been wiped from existence, and with them, the galaxy's greatest threat was finally gone. But the survivors knew that this victory was not the end. It was just the beginning. The galaxy would rebuild, and humanity would stand as its protector, a reminder that even the worst species had underestimated the power of a species born from the stars.